It is an honor to be with you today and talk about one of my favorite things in the world, newborn screening. I am going to have notes because I want to stay on time. So, just in case you're wondering why I have notes. Here are my disclosures. Before I begin, I wanted to introduce who I am because I know not everybody knows who I am here, but my name is Lisa Brackbill and I live in Hershey, Pennsylvania. But I am originally from California, which is why I wear flip-flops everywhere, and I genuinely am Californian above anything else. But I've been married to my husband, Brennan, since 2010. We have 3 children, Victoria, Isaiah, and Caleb. They are 5-year-old twins, which is also why I have notes, because my brain is very tired. I have a degree in political science, and I'm in graduate school. I also have lobbying experience. I'm an author, I'm an advocate, and I helped start the Leukodystrophy Newborn Screening Action Network in 2020. And the whole reason I got into newborn screening is because of this little girl right here. This is my daughter, Victoria. The work that I do today is because of her, and I do this to create a legacy for her, so I couldn't start without briefly showing you who she is. It's a common tale in our community that our children are born healthy and strong, and we're blindsided later by a crushing reality called leukodystrophy. That is certainly our story. At 5 months old, Tori became a completely different baby, as though someone had flipped a light switch. At 6.5 months old, Tori was diagnosed with Krabbe disease, and she died 14 months later at 20 months old. My advocacy began in that small room on diagnosis day, though I didn't truly actively pursue it until after she passed away, because I was her primary caregiver, as most of us are. At that moment, I realized that this was always supposed to be my story as much as I wanted to resist it. My education, my experience, and my skill set were perfectly suited to fight for change, so I learned to embrace it. 10 days before Tori died, we advocated together at the Pennsylvania State Capitol on Rare Disease Day, having no idea that she would soon leave us. 3 weeks after she died, I attended my first meeting of the Pennsylvania Newborn Screening Advisory Board and testified that day about the fact that Krabbe newborn screening was necessary. That day began my learning about newborn screening, and I have continued to learn as much as I can from every possible angle so that I can help others identify and resolve the underlying issues in their state that prevent them from having a robust, expanded newborn screening system. What I learned at those meetings turned into 3 pieces of legislation over a 5-year period, 2 of which failed due to partisan politics, with eventual success in November of 2020. This picture was actually taken in September of 2022 when we finally got our ceremonial signing because of COVID. But because we had to wait, I was able to tell the governor the impact that his signature had already had, because in our first 7 months of screening for Krabbe disease in in Pennsylvania, we found 4 babies. We have now found 5, but I couldn't even believe it. The best part for me was that the first 2 that we found were twins that were born on my daughter's birthday. So, as I said, we did this during COVID. We had just introduced our 3rd bill when COVID hit, and I was determined to get it to the finish line because I was not going to fail again. So, against all odds, we held virtual stakeholder meetings to learn how the bill would impact others, and we made some changes that actually strengthened the bill because we listened. If we hadn't listened to the stakeholders in Pennsylvania, we wouldn't have the program we have today. I do want to mention that my bill did not add Krabbe disease by legislative mandate. Rather, it fixed the issues that prevented it from being included. So these are just some of the things it accomplished, and it obviously highlights the problems we had. In Pennsylvania, screening was not equal from hospital to hospital, which was horrific to me. Not all of our conditions were even mandatory. Only 10 of the 37 conditions we currently were screening for were mandatory. I listened at these newborn screening advisory board meetings incredulously, and I'm like, do you not hear what you're saying? So we are now RUSP aligned as well, but in addition, I added language that allows the advisory board to add non-RUSP conditions that they deem fit. And that was purposeful because there's a lot of leukodystrophies coming down the line. We also shifted the majority of our funding to insurance, which is federally required to pay for newborn screening. Not every state can do this, but in our case it worked. So now our advisory board has control. We don't have to go to the legislature for anything. Not for money, not for permission, nothing. Now it's so much easier. So that is what we did. And the reason I shared all that with you is because I wanted you to know I do have a little bit of experience in fighting some pretty tough battles with newborn screening. But basically today I'm going to talk about what LDMBS is. We're also going to have like a newborn screening 101 because I can't expect you to advocate for something that you don't understand. We'll talk about the different status of newborn screening for leukodystrophies, the impact that the recent ACH-DNC decision for Krabbe may have on advocacy efforts, how LDMBS can help make newborn screening for leukodystrophies a reality, and the resources that we have that you are also welcome to replicate for your own conditions. So I'm not going to read all of this, but we were started in April of 2020 thanks to the vision of Maria Kafalis, and we are focused on advancing newborn screening for leukodystrophies and lysosomal storage disorders, supporting newly diagnosed families, and encouraging collaboration because too often we see people reinventing the wheel or duplicating efforts without realizing it. So that's one of the things that we try to focus on. Before we dive into what newborn screening is, I thought we should hear from the founder of newborn screening. And he said that no child should die or suffer disabilities if a simple blood spot can prevent it. So before we dive into specifics, let's look at what newborn screening is. Newborn screening began 60 years ago with a metabolic condition known as PKU. In the years since, dozens of conditions have been added to state panels and to the Federal Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, or RUSP. It's important to note that newborn screening is not just a test, it is a system, and that makes it complex. It starts with scientists like Dr. Gelb, who developed the actual assay that can detect the disorders, lab technicians who run the tests, state newborn screening programs that manage the entire system, geneticists, genetic counselors, clinicians, specialists who deliver the news, treat the patients, and others. It's also not just one test, but it's three. It involves the dried blood spot, which is the relevant test for leukodystrophies, a pulse oximeter test, and a hearing screen. So the babies heal. This is actually from one of my twins. I insisted that they do the newborn screening in the room, which they don't normally do, because I wanted to see it, and then photograph it. But 24 to 48 hours after birth, they prick, the newborns heal, and they fill up usually 5 blood spots. Some states have moved to 6 to allow for more conditions. And, next slide. What are they looking for in the dried blood spot? So using Krabbe as an example, they are looking for low Gal-C enzyme levels, high cytosine toxin levels as a second-tier screen, and then related gene mutations. The MLD example is that they're looking for elevated sulfatide levels, ARSA activity, and then they will look for related gene mutations. It's a band? Oh, it's the band? It's a live band? I know. It's very, I'm sorry. Yeah. That is also a good reason I have notes. So the most important lesson that I can teach you today is that every state operates very differently to frustrating levels at times. But we're going to go through some of these. But some states have an in-state lab. 12 states use another state's lab. The number of conditions on panels differ from state to state, how conditions are added, and then even how it's funded. It's pretty much different from state to state, which is great. So one way, very sarcastic. One way that states add conditions, which is my favorite way, is through newborn screening advisory boards. 48 states have them. There are 2 states that don't, New York and California, and we'll talk about California later why they don't have one. But they are composed of geneticists, pediatricians, specialists, parents. I actually sit on the LSD subcommittee in Pennsylvania as the parent advocate. I annoyed them enough that they let me be part of it. But of course, as with everything else, the authority of the advisory board differs from state to state. So as I mentioned, we strengthened it in Pennsylvania so that the advisory board has complete power. Some of them still are only recommending it to their Secretary of Health. Others may have to go through other ways, but we're trying to get it so that advisory boards have the power that they should indeed have. So you've likely heard the acronym RUSP before. So I wanted to talk about what it is and what it is not. It is a recommended uniform screening panel. It is not required. That's very important to know. It was implemented in 2010 to encourage uniformity between states. As an example, in 2002, some states were screening for as many as 50 conditions, while others were only screening for 4. In 2005, the ACMG, which is the American College of Medical Genetics, was tasked with developing newborn screening guidelines, and they ultimately put 29 core conditions on the original panel that preceded the RUSP. That list was published in 2005, and in 2010, it officially became known as the RUSP, and it became the nation's minimum newborn screening standard. Its mission to increase uniformity in screening between states has largely been successful, but there's definitely room for improvement. Another acronym you will hear in relation to the RUSP is ACHD&C, which stands for the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, which is why we use an acronym, because it's a really long title. So they were formed in 2003. They review evidence from nomination packages from advocacy groups, and they decide if conditions should be recommended to the Secretary of Health or not. Since 2015, only 5 conditions have been added to the RUSP. It's a whole thing. So, additionally, it can take up to 10 years for RUSP conditions to be added in all states, as Elisa Seeger well knows. XALD's example is that they are currently in 36 states and DC, but they were added to the RUSP 7 years ago. So even though something gets added to the RUSP, it does not necessarily mean that states are going to add it soon or ever. So the Every Life Foundation has been working on encouraging states to implement RUSP alignment policies. And so those are the 11 states that have RUSP alignment legislation in place with a timeline. There's not always accountability in with those timelines, but it does seem like most states are taking it seriously, and Wisconsin is currently considering a bill to do the same thing. So as a leukodystrophy RUSP update, on February 9th, Krabbe got our day in court, so to speak, and Hunter's Hope took the lead on this for us. They submitted our nomination package in July of 2021, and we were absolutely shocked when it came down to the vote because there were clear issues with the process. So on February 9th, the ACHD&C voted 7-7 and interpreted that tie as a no for adding Krabbe disease to the RUSP. The problem was that evidence was ignored, clear bias was shown, like blatant bias, and they should not have interpreted it as a no, but their bylaws don't say anything about whether or not a no is, or a tie is a no or a wait. I would love to see them make it a wait, but we have kind of pioneered this process because no one has ever appealed before. So we appealed in a couple of different ways. We haven't heard anything from the Secretary of Health, but at the second day of the May meeting, they did indicate, the ACHD&C indicated that maybe they were willing to take up some process changes, like an expedited review process for conditions like us, who can easily present the evidence that they said was missing, which was in the nomination package, so that they can reconsider it more quickly. Right now, as far as I know, there's no other disease in the pipeline, so I'm really hoping that the August and November meetings will see Krabbe be added. It's really important that we fix this process, though, because MLD is coming down the line, CTX, GM1, all of these other leukodystrophies are coming down the line that may be considered as controversial as Krabbe, and so we need to fix this. So I also wanted to talk about the ethics behind adding conditions to newborn screening because they're extensive, and I'm not going to read this, but this is the criteria that has generally been followed for decades. So to summarize, most newborn screening programs want to know that there's an accurate test, that there's an approved and effective treatment, and that the treatment can be done in their state. It doesn't always have to be that way, but they would prefer to have it be in state. So why does this matter? Later, we're going to go through the LDNBS 3 pillars of newborn screening advocacy, and this will be helpful for context as we talk about knowing our disease. So I mentioned earlier that there's great disparity within state or amongst states with how they screen, or the number of conditions for which they screen. But I wanted to highlight that it actually is not as drastic as it seems. And part of that is because they count conditions differently. I told you there's a theme here. There's actually a group from the APHL working on this right now, trying to get it to be more standard. But there are 37 core conditions on the RUSP, 26 secondary conditions, which are ones that can almost accidentally be picked up while they're looking for the core conditions. Some states count all of those, plus additional conditions that they screen for that are not on the RUSP, and some states will break diseases down by their different subsets and count those as well. So it's kind of a problem because it looks like California screens for 80, but Louisiana only screens for 34, and it's really not that big of a disparity. So I'm grateful that there are people who have the time to try to fix that problem. All right, so now we're going to look at the current status of newborn screening for the leukodystrophies who are in either active screening stage or the pilot stage. As I mentioned before, despite being added to the RUSP 7 years ago, only 36 states plus DC are actively screening for X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy. Elisa Seeger and the ALD Alliance have done tremendous work, not only with this, but at the federal level to try to improve the RUSP process for states to add them and to end death by zip code. But it shouldn't take this long to see every state screen for a RUSP condition. There are currently 11 states screening for Krabbe disease, with South Carolina being the most recent addition last month. In total, 14 states have agreed to begin screening for Krabbe disease. However, 3 have not implemented yet. New Mexico and Louisiana have had laws in place for years, but there's reasons why they can't screen. And Minnesota's Newborn Screening Advisory Board voted earlier this month to begin the process. Yeah. Isn't that funny? No, there is no reason. It's just, it is really interesting.
So there's not like a person who is putting evidence or similarities, or they don't all go to the same lab or anything?
No, but I do wish that Virginia would join those connected states, but they are very opposed to screening for Krabbe. So they will not add to that, but I thought that was interesting too. So MLD is currently part of the Screen Plus project in New York, and we will talk about that next. In addition, thanks to the efforts of the Ivanovsky family, in honor of their 3 sons who all have or had MLD, Illinois passed a law to begin screening for MLD this year, and it is estimated that they will begin screening sometime in 2024. And there is another state that is beginning the process of implementing a pilot study for MLD as well. In addition, there are several European countries, and this is Saudi Arabia, in case you didn't recognize the shape, because I didn't at first, that are beginning their own pilot studies looking at MLD as well. The most exciting development has been Germany, and now it's public knowledge that they have identified 3 babies with MLD through newborn screening since they began their pilot study. It's very, very exciting. CTX is currently also part of Screen Plus in New York, and they are waiting for a patient to be identified in order to validate the test. CTX already has a treatment. There are actually people like Dr. Gelb working to get rid of this requirement because he's already validated the newborn screening assay on dried blood spots, but right now this is a requirement, so we wait. Well, they also have to prove that the test has identified a patient and then the patient has been treated. So GM1 is also currently part of Screen Plus. They have a little bit different goal in mind. They are working to validate their tests so that when they have an approved treatment, which they believe will be in about 5 years, they can run. They can just run with advocacy. So what is Screen Plus? It is a very unique program that's currently happening in New York State, and I separated these out, but I couldn't determine if this one was actually an LSD, so that's why it's over here, because it wasn't on any lists. But it is a voluntary and consented newborn screening program that's in addition to the normal dried blood spot. And, whoops, I don't know where that note is. So I think it's in 14 hospitals, but I cannot remember. But it's a research program, and the reason that Screen Plus is vitally important is because when you submit to the RUSP, you have to have data behind it. How else are advocacy groups going to have data if they can't have their condition on a pilot program? There are a lot of states that have laws against doing pilot programs, like Pennsylvania, because they believe it's research and they don't want to do research. But Screen Plus is a brilliant way to get around that because It's consented, it's controlled, and it's going to help advocacy groups get the data that they desperately need. So, one of the questions I get most frequently is, why aren't states just screening for everything? Like, if they can screen, why aren't they just doing it? There are some really good reasons, and it's usually not just because they don't want to. Sometimes it feels like advisory boards and decision makers are against us. Been there, because they actually were against screening for Crab A in Pennsylvania until I bugged them enough. But we're going to talk about some of the barriers for expansion. So I mentioned earlier that 12 states actually use another state's lab. And so you can see that here, the state that uses the labs. Some of the pairings are very odd to me. Like Iowa does the newborn screening for Alaska and North and South Dakota. Massachusetts does the screening for 4 New England states, basically everybody except for Connecticut. New Mexico uses Oregon, which is why they can't implement Crab A, because Oregon's not screening for it. Wyoming uses Colorado. Montana does 5 in-state and sends the rest to Wisconsin. I don't know why. I don't know why decisions were made. But because of this, advocacy can be a little bit tricky in these states because sometimes they literally cannot do what you want them to do. So this helps with strategy, though, because we can look at this and say, okay, well, then we need to go after Massachusetts. We don't need to worry about the other states yet. We have to make sure the state has the capability to do it. Oh, sorry, I mentioned that already. Massachusetts does the screening for those. But I did want to highlight that it seems, and this could be because of counting discrepancies. I did not have time to go through and figure out what they were counting in their things. But you can see that Massachusetts claims to screen for 66. None of these 4 states that they do the screening for are doing 66. So there could be potential there, unless it's just a matter of counting differently. So that's one of the challenges. Another challenge, though this is actually yes. No. Usually they have to wait until the state adds it. So like with Iowa, for example, Iowa is working right now on like even adding the latest RUSP conditions, and so we have to wait for Iowa to do it.
Right, but I'm saying Massachusetts is only doing what New Hampshire.
Oh, for New Hampshire, correct. Yes. So these are, yes. Each one of these states does have their own newborn screening advisory board, so they have to agree that they want to screen for those because they still are ultimately responsible for paying for it. Does that make sense? So we would have to go back to those states and say, why aren't you screening for everything on Massachusetts list? And like I said, they might be. They might just count it differently. So then there are also 4 states plus DC that use PerkinElmer. PerkinElmer is a genetics and genomics company that produces a lot of the actual assays, like in kits. So for instance, to screen for Pompe, MPS1, Crab A, a bunch of those, states often buy a kit from PerkinElmer to use in their labs. So states like Pennsylvania, who use PerkinElmer as our state lab, have a distinct advantage because, for instance, PerkinElmer will be done, they say, with their MLD test by the end of the year. So with Pennsylvania, all we have to do is decide to add it, and we can actually add conditions within 6 months because we use PerkinElmer. So that's actually an advantage. So another reason states aren't screening for everything is actually because of RUSP alignment laws. Some of the laws are overly restrictive due to wording, and I'll show you California's example in a second. One of the biggest reasons that I'm not a fan of using legislation for everything is that sometimes well-intended people write bad laws. Ohio's a huge example of that for Crab A disease because once it went through the process, it got amended by politicians who saw that the second-tier test was going to cost more money, and they specifically said, we cannot do second-tier testing, which means there's been countless false positives in Ohio. So it's very important that if you are going to go the legislative route, that the language is clear. Like I said, some of the laws are actually great. Like in Pennsylvania, we are allowed to do whatever we want, which is pretty great. But the bottom line here is that, like I said, the laws need to be added clearly, but also it is important that some states decide to be first and go above the RUSP and add things because it encourages other states to do so. So like with Illinois coming online with MLD, it is our hope that other states are going to see that they are handling it well, that it's going smoothly, and then they'll likely be willing to add it. So we have to learn from other states with both the good and the bad. But the biggest thing tends to be a lack of funding. So that's why my work in Pennsylvania sought to take the legislature out of the equation, because often newborn screening is not a fiscal priority, mostly just because people don't understand what it is. So some of it can be due to state funding structures that they can't just add conditions. Another big problem has been that the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Reauthorization Act at the federal level has failed to be renewed for several years in a row. It actually, last session, was one senator holding it up. Another reason to leave politicians out of this if we can, but that bill provides funding to states to help them with their newborn screening programs. So without that federal money being available, they can't do that. And I know that's been a big part of Elisa's work as well. A gentleman from Kentucky, Rand Paul, he believes that consent should be part of newborn screening. And okay, so I'm not going to go deep into these, but here are some other things that are a little important that I've already seen be hurdles. In the last couple of years, there have been some incidents in Michigan and New Jersey that led to lawsuits related to dried blood spot usage. The one in New Jersey was a matter of law enforcement using a dried blood spot to convict that child's father of a crime. That is not okay. At the time, only one state had a law on the books to prevent that, and that was Iowa. I do believe states should develop some stronger policies about how dried blood spots could be used, because in Michigan, even though Michigan was doing everything correctly, they were consenting parents to store the dried blood spots for research, and they're all de-identified, so no one knows who they are. A group of parents successfully sued the state of Michigan, claiming that their constitutional rights had been infringed upon. And as far as I know, we're still waiting on the circuit court. I actually forgot to look up an update to rule on that. But as a result, Michigan had to destroy 3 million dried blood spots. That is devastating to the research community. And a lot of it came from misunderstanding. But the other thing that I have seen is that the general distrust, which I believe is misplaced, but the distrust of the public health system by some after COVID is also, it can potentially impact the newborn screening system because it is public health. Public health relies on trust, which is why newborn screening is not a consented program. So there are just some things to keep in mind as we advocate. This is definitely a really interesting time for leukodystrophy newborn screening for so many conditions. But for a lot of us, we have to wait right now. And I know it's not fun to wait. No one wants to. We all want to go out and do things. But like for Krabbe, we're waiting for the ACH-DNC. For MLD, we're waiting not only for PerkinElmer to have an available test, but we're waiting for the FDA to approve the treatment before we can really run with this. So sometimes we just have to wait. And I know that waiting is difficult, but there are some things that we can be doing, that you can be doing in the meantime to prepare for your condition to be ready to go. So we have 3 pillars of advocacy at LDNBS, and they go in this order. So know your disease, know your state, and then know your story. We say it's important first to know your disease because with any leukodystrophy or LSD, you know that not every condition has a test. Not every condition has a treatment. So if that's the case, it's really pointless to advocate. So it's really important that you know what you're up against and that your condition is even ready for that. The next step is to know your state, because it's important to know, how your state operates, what the underlying issues could be, like the ones I uncovered in Pennsylvania, and that does take time, and it takes listening to the stakeholders to figure out what those issues are. If they have a newborn screening advisory board, as 48 states do they have a nomination form that you can fill out to submit it, like at least 5 states do? And then, like I said, if there are any underlying issues, only 2 states actually require legislation to add conditions. And I think that's very encouraging because, as I said before, my experience has taught me that the best way is truly to go through newborn screening advisory boards and state labs because they are the medical experts. They understand the needs of their newborn screening program and system. And honestly, it's a lot easier in most cases because you leave politics out of it. I watched this play out in Pennsylvania as my nonpartisan bill became partisan because of the bill's sponsor. And I know this verbatim, this was not speculation. The policy advisor to the Speaker of the House told me that my 2 bills were dead because of who sponsored it. And that's actually what made me become nonpartisan. Because I was like, this is ridiculous that you won't look at this bill that is going to save babies because of who sponsored it. So I truly believe politicians should not be the sole dictators of health policy. We should, as the medical community.
So you said that one option is to go through state labs, like them sponsoring a bill?
No, you don't even need a bill. In 48 states, you don't even need a bill. You just need the Secretary of Health to say, do this. Sometimes you have to do, like, sometimes they might have to go back to the legislature to ask for money, but that's appropriations. That's not actually trying to get a bill through the whole process. But of course, every state's different.
Yeah, so there's like a legislation route where you can like write a bill and maybe go directly to.
Right. Yeah, you can go the legislative route. It's exhausting and it's not necessary. So why wouldn't we want to do it the easier way? So I'm going to show 2 state examples because they highlight some of the key points I've mentioned. So starting with my home state, California does not have a newborn screening advisory board. They rely on the ACHD&C for that function, which until February I would have said was a really good idea. But then they did that to Crebe. They add all conditions within 2 years of RUSP alignment. But because of this, because of the way that they interpret their law, there is no advocacy pathway. Back in 2015, we were visiting my family, and so we went to talk to my parents' representative, and he's the one who alerted me to the fact that the way their 2012 law is written, they will only add RUSP conditions. So California is one of those states where we are just itching because of the high birth rate. We would love to see these conditions added, but unfortunately, we cannot. And then Rhode Island is a great example of a state with RUSP alignment legislation that can't fully do what it wants because it relies on Massachusetts lab. So even if they wanted to add Crebe, MLD, or another condition today, they can't. They have to wait for Massachusetts. So if anybody in here is from Massachusetts, that is that is one of the high states on my list to make some changes.
Well, I wanted to mention, I was advocate for newborn screening in California, and once we got it approved there, they would not begin screening until it was added to the RUSP. So
Right.
a whole other issue they had to deal with, so they have not screened for 2 years.
Yes, it's a great example of a well-intended law that was just written a little bit too strictly. So the last pillar that we use is knowing your story, and we put that last because it's the easiest part. We have lived this. Most of us could talk for hours about our child, our experience, and our trauma because our child wasn't screened at birth. However, most decision makers don't have that much time. So you need to develop a pitch, and I have been told that there is actually a gentleman here who can help you do that this week. So you need to develop a pitch, which is a shorter version that packs in all the relevant information, and then you can always let them ask you questions. You can also create a one-pager, which I will show later on for the ones we've made for the MLD community. But as you're crafting your pitch, learning about your disease and your state helps you. Because as you're learning, you can look for known or potential obstacles to adding your condition. You can also consider what will speak their language. Sometimes it's comparing to other states. That was one of my tactics in Pennsylvania because we were second to last in the nation at the time for mandatory conditions. They did not like that. Sometimes it's data and statistics. Usually it's data and statistics, while also appealing to the ethical and moral aspects of newborn screening. But it's almost always about saving money while saving lives. And I have ideas about how to incorporate those things and examples from my work if you're interested in the future. I also wanted to point out that offering a solution to the problem is great when possible, but it's not your job to do that. Your job as an advocate is to make the decision makers aware of the issue, tell your story and ask them to help, but don't take on the extra stress of trying to do this by yourself and to fix a broken system. Let them help you. So while telling your story is incredibly impactful, it's important to note that sometimes our stories just aren't enough. by themselves. And that's why we ordered these pillars as we did. More than once when I have testified, much of the data, quote unquote, that was given in opposition to screening for Krabbe was inaccurate, even at the ACHDNC. Thankfully, I had my own published data to counter with what they said, and I thought this quote summed it up pretty well. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So it's not that your story isn't powerful or enough, but you have to remember that they are hearing, especially the newborn screening advisory boards, they're hearing from condition after condition, and you need to stand out. And standing out means knowing your stuff. But I also loved this quote from Brene Brown that said, maybe stories are just data with a soul. It takes both. It takes our stories, but it also takes facts and data. So knowing your disease, science, and statistics along with your human story will have the most impact. Coupled with your example of how newborn screening might have changed your life, and obviously your child's, will influence decision makers to support you. But these are some things I really wanted to point out as you interact with decision makers. It's so important to always be kind, to remember that they are human too. They have a job to do. Sometimes their hands are tied, especially in anything related to the state. In the state of Ohio, for example, the director of the lab can't even talk to anybody above her supervisor because they run it kind of like the military. So it's just important to note that there might be things we don't know about how things are run. So humility is a really good thing. Building relationships and coalitions is key, that is the underlying mission of LDMBS, is to get people to work across leukodystrophies for conditions that are not theirs in their state, because we all need each other's help. So build relationships with anybody you can, and that can be your state representatives and senators, because they often know how to help push buttons. It can be their staff, which honestly the staff do most of the work anyway. The newborn screening director in your state, which if you live in Kansas, I don't know if anybody here is from Kansas, but the new newborn screening program manager is actually a Krabbe sibling. So he is definitely sympathetic to leukodystrophy. So also find other groups within your state that are working on common goals, like a rare disease advisory council, or NORD has different task forces that are working in different regions, and you can meet people from other rare diseases that might either know people that you don't know or have ideas you haven't tried. So definitely build relationships and coalitions. You can be creating one-pagers or other resources. I've actually been helping the MSD community with developing a one-pager so they can begin to advocate. Determine what has been done in your state before. It may be possible that there have already been laws put into place, like in Pennsylvania. There had been a law to screen for Krabbe and other LSDs, but it hadn't been implemented because of the issues that I then had to fix. But if I hadn't known that, it would have been redundant. And then examine the playing field, which is kind of like building coalitions. Don't duplicate efforts. We are so much stronger when we work together, and it's such a better use of time, energy, and resources. So I would really encourage that as well. I'm now going to show some examples of resources that LDMBS has developed, and this QR code will be available at the end as well. And if you have ideas for resources that would be useful to you, please let me know, because we're always willing to help with that. First, this is my baby. I have been working on this spreadsheet for 3 years, and I love spreadsheets. This has everything that would have been incredibly useful for me to know about Pennsylvania when I was beginning to advocate, and I've been adding things as I go. I know it's really small. This is available on our website for anybody to use, and we've also been making the data more accessible to those who don't like spreadsheets, but this has an incredible amount of information, and I love it. There are also 2 tabs at the bottom of the spreadsheet. This one is the one for Krabbe disease. This is how I start to kind of look at the landscape and figure out the strategy, because for Krabbe disease, so first this is obviously who's already screening for Krabbe, or is there already something started? Do they have a RUSP alignment law in place? Because in theory, that takes them off of the list for ones we really have to work in. But then I also know which ones are screening for Pompe and MPS 1, because if they are already screening for those with certain methodologies, they can add Krabbe disease in for almost no money and no effort, no time, no extra staff, but they don't always know that. So that's that one. So how we've been breaking this data down to make it more accessible is we started this year doing a state report card project. So every week we focus on a new state, and we share Krebe and MLD stories when we can. We don't have them for every state, so if you know anybody, this week has been Minnesota, but we do this to help give some really just basic information about each state to paint a picture, but then also to get the beautiful faces of the kids up there. I also do try to create reels to educate about newborn screening, but I do have 5-year-old twins who are very loud, so I don't get to do a lot of reels. This is the one-pager that I was talking about. In partnership with Orchard Therapeutics, we've been developing fact sheets for 2 years now, and we have 18 done. And yes, Lexi, and this is Lexi, she's in the room. And so this is such a wonderful way to concisely explain what is newborn screening, why does it matter, how can you help, but then it also includes important data about each state. Like, in Illinois, it takes an average of 2 years to begin screening for a condition once it's on the RUSP, but this is how many kids are missing screening during those gaps. So these are great, and they're free to the families. They can use them, we can use them in advocacy, and it's something that they can tangibly take with them, and then that face stays with the decision makers. So this is something you might partner with your industry partners. Sorry, the music is so distracting. You might, this could be a potential that you could do. It doesn't even have to be as ornate as this. It can just have the simple facts. And finally, we have a YouTube channel that, again, I wish we had more time for, but I am proud of what we've been able to produce so far. We did a Facebook Live with Newborn Screening Advisory Board members, including the man who used to be my greatest enemy, who's now my greatest ally in Pennsylvania, and our very own Bob Rauner. We actually did a joint effort with the EverLife Foundation with the Newborn Screening Boot Camp, and then we did 2 Facebook Lives with newborn screening moms. One is an ALD mom, one is a Krebe mom. And we talked to them about their experience with newborn screening, and it was very honest. This was not a sell us on newborn screening. It was like, what could have gone better? And we learned a lot from that about the lack of psychosocial support that is happening for these families, because it's so easy to look at them from our perspective of those who have lost children and be like, oh, you're so lucky. But they don't feel that way. They don't always feel that way. And so it's just important to keep that in mind as we advocate. But we are very excited about that. So anyway, there's the QR code again. And then I wanted to mention some other tremendous resources that you could use. The EverLife Foundation has a ton of resources, so does NORD, but also Expecting Health. And I am one of their newborn screening ambassadors, so kind of biased, but their focus has been on educating expecting mothers that newborn screening is even going to happen, to help bridge that gap in knowledge, because I don't know how many of you remember that newborn screening even happened. I did not with Tori. And so I can't imagine like a week later finding out your child has a terminal disease and you have to get to treatment right now. So they are working on bridging that gap in knowledge, and I think it's great. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me today. I've spent the last 8 years learning as much as I possibly can about all of this so that you don't have to, because it is very complex. I learn new things all the time still, but that's why we're here. We want to help everybody be successful in getting as many newborns screened for their condition as possible, and so that's why we're here. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, Anne.
I know you don't have the answer to this, but I know it's a vital question for the community and like the ULF thinking about and putting some efforts. But you have these states that are RUSP blind, but if RUSP never approves the test, what are we going to do to change the legislation in those states to get newborn screening added? So I think that's a problem here, or something that.
Do you mean in states like California?
Yeah, just, I live in Florida. Florida has a RUSP alignment for Krebe disease. But will they ever screen for Krebe if Krebe doesn't get approved by the RUSP? So how do we change those laws? How do we go after that kind of legislation to make changes?
As far as I know, which I admittedly have not read all 11. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'll repeat the question. She asked what we can do in the states that tend to either only follow the RUSP or only want to follow the RUSP. How can we encourage them to add these conditions? I can see two pathways. One, I don't even think they would have to be legislation because I haven't read all 11 states' laws recently or probably ever. I've read some of them. But I don't think all of them are as strict as California. So it might just be a matter of persuasion. Sometimes you might have to go in and add words like we did, where we said the advisory board can do this. They can add non-RUSP conditions. But really, of course, it's a state-by-state matter, which is the common theme here. I have actually been encouraged by Florida because they do add within 18 months of the RUSP. They do seem willing. There's plenty of advocates there. So it would be interesting to have a conversation with the newborn screening director and just see what they would say.
I just have a question for Russ for any of the conditions. How does having a treatment impact getting on the newborn screening?
So the question was basically, why do they have to have a treatment to be on the RUSP for newborn screening? That was basically... Yes, because that's part of the ethical considerations, because you don't want... This is something I struggled with when I first started attending advisory board meetings. But as I've sat in them for 8 years, I kind of understand it a little better. So you would think, as a parent, that you would want that knowledge that my child's going to die. But if there's nothing that can be done, ethicists have pondered this for years, and they all agree that we shouldn't give them that knowledge. It's a little bit different with late onset things because, you know, in the meantime, like a treatment could be developed. But to me now it makes sense that you would want that parent to have, like for us, those perfect 5 months without that, without that weighing on you if there's nothing that can be done. And so I know it's hard, especially from our perspective of knowing what we went through. But I do understand the ethics behind it now. So they have to have a treatment and a test that has very low or no false positives to also prevent that stress on the family. Anybody else have any questions? I know that was a lot. This was like newborn screening overload. But I hope that you feel encouraged, if nothing else, because we have made great, great strides. We are about to make so many great strides, but it really is going to take all of us. You know, I spoke to Montana's Newborn Screening Advisory Board in November, which felt really random because I don't live there. And they were like, do we have anybody in the state? And I'm like, I don't know any Krabbe child in the state. So that also makes them less likely to add it. So it's so important that we try to find families in each state that are willing to even just be the face of it. Lexi and her family have been so helpful and willing to do that in Illinois, as well as some other Illinois families, as an example. Just being willing to say, hey, we are here. This happened to us. So in the meantime, that's something you could do, is work on identifying your families, prepping them to tell their stories. Yeah, and we can do this, but it's going to take all of us. All right, if there are no more questions. Oh, do you have a question? Oh, no. LDNBS.org. Yeah, and there's my fancy QR code that I learned how to make for this. That just takes us to our resources page, but yeah, you can also email Lisa, which is LESA at LDNBS.org if you have questions. All right, well, thank you all. And like I said, if you have any questions, I'm always available.